Have you ever wondered what it feels like when the world simply stops? When streets you've walked 1,000 times vanish beneath snow so deep it rewrites the landscape? When the hum of ordinary life, cars, voices, the rhythm of commerce falls silent beneath a blanket of white so complete it feels almost sacred? Tonight, we drift back to January 1978, to a week when the heart of America froze into stillness, when nature reminded millions that all our schedules and certainties are fragile things, easily erased by wind and cold. As we prepare to wander into the snowbound silence of the Midwest and Northeast, I'd love for you to tap the like button, just a small sign that you're ready for tonight as gentle passage. And if you'd like these journeys to be waiting whenever you need them, subscribing will keep them close at hand. Tell me, too, where you're listening from and what hour has reached you now. Some of you are leaning into the quiet of night, others are stepping into the light of day, and all of us share this moment together. Now lower the lights, find the stillness in the room, and let's begin our quiet walk back through history. The calendar reads January 1978. Disco plays on AM radio, gas stations still pump leaded fuel. The Cold War hums in the background of every news broadcast, a distant anxiety most people have learned to ignore. Winter has already settled across the northern states, the ordinary kind of winter, predictable and manageable. But something is gathering in the atmosphere, something the instruments can barely comprehend. Two vast systems of air, one Arctic and merciless, the other warm and moisture-laden from the Gulf, are moving toward collision over the Great Lakes. The pressure is dropping in a way that makes veteran meteorologists pause at their charts, rechecking their numbers. Most people don't notice. They go to work, they make dinner, they complain about the cold in that casual way people do when winter is routine. They don't yet know that in a matter of hours the world they understand will be buried beneath walls of white, that roads will become rivers of snow, that time itself will seem to freeze. Let us begin where all great storms begin, in the ordinary morning, in the last hours before everything changes. You wake up on the morning of January 25th, 1978, to a silence that feels heavier than usual. Not the peaceful quiet of fresh snow, something denser, more expectant. The air itself seems to be holding its breath. Your bedroom is cold. The furnace has been running all night, but the chill has crept into the corners anyway, settling into the floorboards, clinging to the walls. You pull the blankets tighter for just a moment longer, delaying the inevitable meeting with the cold air beyond your cocoon of warmth. When you finally rise, your feet meet the shock of the floor, cold even through your socks. You shuffle to the window and pull back the curtain. The sky is a flat, colorless grey, the kind that seems to press down on the rooftops. Snow is already falling, but gently, almost decoratively. Nothing alarming. Nothing you haven't seen 100 times before. The radio chatters in the kitchen as you make coffee. Between songs you've heard too many times, the announcer's voice takes on a slightly more serious tone. Winter storm warnings, heavy snow expected, possible travel difficulties. You've heard this before. You pour your coffee and consider the day ahead, work, errands, the usual rhythm of Wednesday obligations. But something nags at you. The barometric pressure in your sinuses, perhaps, or the strange quality of the light, the way the wind has begun to test the windows, pressing against the glass with increasing insistence. You dress in layers, an undershirt, a flannel shirt, a sweater. You consider an extra pair of socks. The house feels colder than it should, despite the thermostat reading a reasonable temperature. It's as if the cold is already seeping in through invisible cracks, preparing for something your conscious mind hasn't yet grasped. Outside, your neighbor is scraping frost from his windshield. He waves, you wave back. Neither of you speaks. The wind carries voices away these days. You don't know it yet, But this is the last morning of the world as you understand it. By nightfall, every familiar landmark will be erased. By tomorrow, you'll measure time differently, not in hours or days, but in the intervals between radio broadcasts, in the slow depletion of candles, in the rhythm of shoveling that never ends. The snow begins in earnest around mid-morning. You're at work, an office building with fluorescent lights that hum their usual monotonous note, with coffee that's been sitting on the burner too long, with the familiar faces of people you see more often than your own family. Someone mentions the weather, someone always mentions the weather, but this time there's a note of concern. The radio in the break room reports that several counties have issued travel advisories. The snow is falling faster than plows can clear it. The wind is picking up. You look out the window. Already the parking lot is transforming. The neat lines of cars are softening, becoming suggestions beneath accumulating white. The trees along the property line sway and bend, their branches sketching frantic patterns against the grey sky. By noon, management makes the decision everyone should go home. Now, before conditions worsen, you gather your coat, your scarf, your gloves. The act of bundling feels more serious today, more deliberate. You're preparing not just for cold, but for something unnamed. The moment you step outside, the wind hits you like a physical force. It doesn't gust, it pushes, steady and relentless, carrying snow that doesn't fall so much as fly horizontally. The flakes are small, hard, almost like tiny pellets of ice. They sting where they hit exposed skin. The parking lot has become a strange landscape. The cars are already half buried. Snow has drifted against the windward sides of vehicles, creating sculptural forms that look almost intentional, almost artistic. Your car is somewhere in the third row. You think you can see it. The walk across the parking lot takes longer than it should. The snow is already above your ankles, and with each step, you sink deeper. The wind tears at your coat, finds every gap and seam. Your eyes water from the cold. You squint against the flying snow, trying to orient yourself. When you finally reach your car, you realize the full scope of what's happening. The driver's side is buried in a drift that reaches to the door handle. You begin to dig with your gloved hands, scooping away armfuls of snow that feel strangely dense, almost solid. By the time you clear enough to open the door, your fingers are already going numb despite the gloves. The engine turns over, thank God, and you let it run, waiting for warmth that comes too slowly. Other cars around you are attempting to leave. Some succeed. Others spin their wheels uselessly, digging themselves deeper into snow that's accumulating by the minute. The drive home should take 15 minutes. It takes an hour and 20 minutes. The roads have disappeared. There are no lanes anymore, no clear demarcation between pavement and shoulder. There are only the vague tracks of vehicles that passed before you, already filling in with fresh snow. You follow taillights when you can see them through the whiteout conditions. Sometimes you lose sight of them entirely, and for long moments you're driving blind, trusting memory and instinct to keep you on what you hope is still the road. The windshield wipers struggle. They beat a rhythm against the glass, a steady, almost hypnotic sound, but they can barely keep up. Between each sweep, snow immediately obscures your view again. You lean forward, gripping the steering wheel, your shoulders tight with tension. Other cars have given up. You pass them, or you think you pass them. Dark shapes hunched at the side of the road, already being consumed by drifts. You wonder if people are still inside them, waiting, or if they've abandoned their vehicles to seek shelter elsewhere. When you finally turn onto your street, relief floods through you. But the street itself is unrecognizable. The houses stand like islands in a white sea. The trees that line the boulevard have become ghostly figures, their forms distorted by the weight of snow and the constant whipping of the wind. You park, or rather, you stop the car in approximately the right location and turn off the engine. The sudden silence inside the car is profound, broken only by the muffled roar of wind outside. For just a moment, you sit there, gathering strength for the next task. The distance from your car to your front door is perhaps 30 feet. It might as well be a mile. You step out into the storm, and immediately the wind tries to push you back. The snow is already mid-calf deep and drifting higher against obstacles. Each step requires effort, lifting your leg high, plunging it down into uncertain depth, finding purchase, repeating. The wind howls, and that's the word everyone uses, howl, but until you experience it, until you stand in the full force of a blizzard wind, you don't understand the sound. It's not a single note. It's a chorus of pitches, rising and falling, screaming around corners and through bare branches, a sound that feels ancient and alive, as if the storm itself is a creature with voice and intention. Snow fills your collar, finds its way into your sleeves, stings your face. You lower your head and push forward. By the time you reach your door, you're breathing hard, your lungs aching from the cold air. Inside, you shed layers of snow-covered clothing in the entryway. Your coat is encrusted with ice. Your boots leave puddles that spread across the floor. You're shivering despite the warmth of the house, your body still remembering the assault of the cold. The house feels smaller now. The windows, usually a connection to the outside world, have become television screens showing only one channel, white, static. The wind presses against the glass, making it creak and flex. You can hear it finding every gap in the siding, every loose shingle, testing the integrity of your shelter. You turn on the television. The local news is already in emergency broadcasting mode. Maps show swirling white covering state after state. The meteorologist's voice is calm but firm. This is historic. This is unprecedented. Do not travel. Stay inside. Prepare for extended power outages. The phone rings. Your mother, checking in. The line crackles with static. You assure her you're home, you're safe. She tells you to fill the bathtub with water, just in case, to find the flashlights, to check on your neighbours if you can. The line cuts out before you can say goodbye. The afternoon darkens early, the way winter afternoons do, but this darkness feels more complete. The snow erases distinctions between earth and sky. Everything is one undifferentiated white, and you find yourself losing the sense of horizon, of up and down. You begin to prepare, moving through the house with a growing sense of being under siege. You fill pots and pans with water. You gather candles and matches. You pull out the camping lantern from the back of the closet, check its batteries. You open the cabinet where you keep canned goods, mentally calculating how long they might last. The furnace cycles on and off, working harder than usual. You stand near the vent, feeling the warm air, reassuring yourself that the system is still functioning. But you can feel the cold pushing in from outside, seeping through the walls, settling into the far corners of rooms. Night falls, though you can't pinpoint exactly when. The white darkness simply becomes a darker white, then grey, then a peculiar luminescence. The snow itself seems to glow, reflecting back whatever minimal light exists. The power flickers at 7 p.m. The lights dim, return, dim again. You hold your breath. Then, with a soft mechanical sigh, everything goes dark. The silence is immediate and profound. The furnace stops its humming. The refrigerator ceases its background drone. The clock on the microwave goes black. All the white noise of modern living, the sounds so constant you've stopped hearing them, vanishes, and what remains is just the wind and your own breathing and the sudden loud beating of your heart. You light candles. Their flames cast moving shadows that make the familiar room strange. You wrap yourself in blankets and settle near the fireplace if you have one, or huddle in the kitchen near the gas stove if you don't. The house is already growing colder. You can feel it, a gradual theft of warmth, degree by degree. The radio becomes your lifeline. You turn the dial carefully, finding the emergency broadcast frequency. The batteries are old and you need to make them last. You allow yourself 5 minutes of listening every hour. The news is the same each time. The storm continues, roads are impassable, power crews cannot respond. Stay inside, conserve food and water, check on elderly neighbours if possible. But going outside, even to the house next door, seems impossible. Through the window you can barely make out the shape of your neighbour's porch light, dark now like yours. The space between houses might as well be Arctic tundra. You try to sleep, piled under every blanket you own. But the cold makes sleep fitful and strange. You dream of being buried alive, of endless white, of searching for something you can't name through corridors of snow. You wake frequently, disoriented, checking your watch by candlelight, surprised each time by how little time has passed. The wind never stops. It becomes a kind of companion, an entity with moods and rhythms. Sometimes it screams, sometimes it moans, sometimes it falls to a whisper, and in those moments the silence feels even more ominous, as if the storm is gathering breath for another assault. Morning reveals the full scope of your new reality. The windows are partially blocked by snow drifted against them. Where you can see out, the world has been completely rewritten. Your car is a smooth white mound. The fence that borders your yard has vanished. The street signs, the mailboxes, the fire hydrants, all gone, buried beneath snow, measured not in inches, but in feet. You've never seen anything like this. You've lived through winters your entire life, but this is different. This isn't snow that falls and accumulates. This is snow that erases, that transforms the fundamental topography of your world. You need to shovel, not because you're going anywhere you're not, but because the front door is blocked, and some instinct tells you that you must maintain a way out, an escape route, even if there's nowhere to escape to. Dressed in every warm thing you own, you open the door. Snow cascades into your entryway. The wall of white in front of you is chest high. You begin to dig. The snow is strange. The top layer is powder, but beneath it's been compressed by wind into something denser, almost concrete-like. Your shovel bites into it with difficulty. You lift, throw. Within minutes your shoulders are burning. Within 10 minutes you're sweating despite the cold. Within 20 minutes you need to stop, gasping, your breath making white clouds that are torn away by the wind. You look back at your progress. You've cleared perhaps 3 feet. The drift extends for another 10 feet before you'd reach what you think is the sidewalk. And even as you stand there, snow is already beginning to fill in what you've just cleared, wind-driven flakes skittering across the surface, settling into your shovel marks. This is when you understand. This is futile. This is not a storm you can overcome with effort. This is a storm you can only endure. You retreat inside. Your clothes are soaked with sweat and melted snow. You change into dry things, hanging the wet garments near the fireplace, hoping they'll dry. You're shivering again, that deep cold that comes from exertion, followed by inactivity. The house is noticeably colder. You can see your breath when you're not near a heat source. The corners of rooms have become cold zones. Frost is forming on the inside of windows. The pipes haven't frozen yet, but you know it's only a matter of time. You light the oven, leave the door open for warmth. It helps, but it also depletes your gas more quickly. You'll need to ration this too. Everything must be rationed now. Heat, food, water, energy, hope. Time becomes strange. Without the usual markers, work, appointments, television programs, the coming and going of daylight in predictable patterns, the hours blend and stretch. You're not sure what day it is anymore. Thursday? Friday? The calendar on the wall says one thing, but your internal sense of time has become unmoored. The radio remains your only connection to the larger world. You learn that you're not alone. Millions are experiencing this same isolation, this same cold, this same surreal entombment in white. The entire Midwest and portions of the Northeast have been paralyzed. The National Guard has been mobilized but can barely move. People have died, frozen in their cars, caught outside, overwhelmed by the cold in their own homes when heat failed. You try not to think about that last part. You measure your day in small tasks, rationing your food, a can of soup for lunch, heated slowly on the gas stove, eaten directly from the pot to conserve dishes and the water needed to wash them, melting snow for non-drinking water, because the warnings about boiling it are serious and your fuel is limited. Checking the perimeter of the house, looking for problems, ice dams forming on the roof, drafts that need to be plugged with towels, the slow creep of cold into the basement. You write by candlelight, though you're not sure why. Maybe just to maintain some connection to normalcy, to purpose. You journal your experience, describing the sound of the wind, the quality of the light, the strange thoughts that emerge in isolation. The silence between wind gusts is profound. In those moments, you become aware of the absolute absence of the usual sounds. No cars, no planes overhead, no distant sirens, no neighbors' voices, no dogs barking. Just silence, as if the entire human world has been muted. You find yourself thinking about the past, about other winters, about childhood snow days that seemed magical rather than menacing. You remember sledding snowmen, the excitement of school cancellations. This isn't that. This is snow as adversary, winter as siege. Your body begins to adapt, though not comfortably. You wear so many layers that you've lost the shape of yourself. You're a shuffling collection of sweaters and coats and scarves. Your movements are slower, more deliberate, conserving energy. Your hands are perpetually cold. Even when you hold them near the stove, the warmth doesn't seem to penetrate. Your fingertips have a strange numbness, and you worry about frostbite, though you haven't been outside long enough for that. It's just the persistent cold, the way it leaches into everything. Sleep becomes deeper and more urgent. Your body wants to hibernate to conserve resources. You find yourself sleeping 10, 12 hours at a stretch, wrapped in blankets near whatever heat source you can maintain. Your dreams are vivid and strange, full of endless white landscapes of searching for warmth, of being buried and digging your way out, only to find yourself buried again. Hunger is a constant companion, but you resist it. The food must last. You don't know how long this will continue. The radio keeps saying soon, but soon is meaningless when each day feels eternal. You notice other changes. Your skin is dry, cracked at the knuckles. Your lips are chapped despite the petroleum jelly you apply. Your eyes feel strained from the constant whiteness outside the windows, from the dim candlelight inside. Your muscles ache from the cold, from the tension of constant shivering, from the brief bursts of shoveling that accomplish nothing. A routine emerges not by choice but by necessity. You wake when light begins to penetrate the blocked windows, though light is generous. The dawn is grey and reluctant. You lie in your nest of blankets, postponing the moment when you must face the cold. Eventually hunger or bladder wins. You rise quickly and move to whatever heat source remains, the dying embers of last night's fire, the pilot light on the stove, the accumulated warmth of your own breath in the small space you've learned to confine yourself to. You allow yourself 1 cup of instant coffee made with water heated on the stove. You hold the cup with both hands, absorbing its warmth, making it last. The radio at the top of each hour, 5 minutes of listening. News that is repetitive but necessary, which roads are attempting to reopen, where emergency shelters have been established, what the forecast predicts. Always the same advice: stay inside, conserve resources, check on neighbors if possible. You cannot check on neighbours. The distance is too great, the snow too deep, the cold too dangerous. The day stretches. You read by window light when there's enough. Old books, magazines you've read before. Anything to occupy your mind. When the light fails, you sit in semi-darkness, conserving candles. You think about food more than you want to. You fantasize about hot meals, about abundance, about going to a restaurant and ordering whatever you want. These thoughts are both comforting and torturous. You think about warmth, about summer days, about the feeling of sun on your skin, about being too hot and complaining about it, a complaint that seems absurd now, almost offensive in its obliviousness. The wind continues. It has become the voice of the storm, a constant narrator of your captivity. You find yourself listening to its variations, learning to predict its surges, knowing when a gust is coming by the way the house begins to creak. Night falls early, always early. The darkness is no longer frightening. It's just another fact, like the cold, like the snow. You light 1 or 2 candles, no more. You eat a small meal. You listen to the radio. You wrap yourself in blankets and wait for sleep. Tomorrow will be the same, and the day after, until it isn't. In the isolation, small things become significant. You notice the pattern of frost on the window, delicate fractals forming and reforming, nature's mathematics made visible. You find this beautiful in a way you never would have before. Beauty and threat combined. You notice the quality of silence. You realize you've never truly experienced quiet before. There was always something, the hum of electricity, the distant murmur of traffic, the ambient sound of human civilization. Now in the spaces between wind, there is nothing. Pure absence of sound. It's disorienting at first, then almost meditative. You notice your own thoughts more clearly. Without the usual distractions, television, radio beyond your rationed minutes, the busyness of normal life, your mind has time and space to wander. Some thoughts are dark. Fears about the cold, about food running out, about the pipes finally freezing, about the storm never ending. Other thoughts are strangely peaceful. Memories of people you love, gratitude for shelter, however cold, recognition of your own resilience. You notice time differently. Clock time has become almost meaningless. You're operating on body time now, sleeping when exhausted, eating when hungry, moving when necessary. There's something ancient about this, something that connects you to humans who lived before schedules and appointments, who measured their days by light and dark, and the demands of survival. You notice that you're talking to yourself. Not constantly, but occasionally. Small comments, observations, questions. Is this water enough? The wind is worse today. I should probably eat something. Your voice sounds strange in the empty house, both familiar and foreign. The storm continues. 3 days? 4? You've lost count. The radio says the system is massive, slow-moving, unprecedented. They use words like historic and catastrophic. These words wash over you, you're living it. You don't need adjectives, you wait. That's what this has become, an exercise in waiting. Not waiting for something specific, just waiting for it to be over, for conditions to change, for the world to resume. The waiting is its own kind of hardship. The cold you can layer against, the hunger you can endure. But the waiting, the not knowing when this will end, the uncertainty about what comes next, this is harder than the physical discomforts. You find yourself making small bargains with the storm, with time, with whatever force might be listening. If I wake up tomorrow and the wind has stopped, if I can just get through today, if the power comes back, you imagine the moment of deliverance. The sound of a snowplow in the distance, the flicker of lights returning. The ability to open your door and see neighbours, to hear human voices, to be part of the world again rather than isolated in your small, cold pocket of existence. But for now, you wait. The snow continues to fall, the wind continues to howl, the cold continues to press in, and you continue to endure, hour by hour, a quiet struggle repeated endlessly, a test you never asked to take. You are one of millions experiencing this same trial, though you can't see them, can't reach them. Somewhere beyond the white, life continues. But here, in this moment, in this house, in this storm, time has stopped. You've been compressed into the eternal present, cold, white, endless, waiting. Let us shift our attention now from the experience of the storm to its prediction, from those who endured to the one who foresaw. John William Hambleton was not a man who sought attention. In photographs from the era, he appears slight, with wire-rimmed glasses and thinning hair combed neatly to one side. His smile, when it appeared, was hesitant, as if unsure of its welcome. He wore short-sleeved button-down shirts with pocket protectors, the uniform of a certain kind of mid-century American professional, men who worked with precision instruments and found comfort in data. He had worked for the National Weather Service since 1956, stationed in Cleveland, Ohio. For more than 2 decades, he had studied the sky through numbers, barometric pressure, humidity percentages, temperature gradients, wind velocities. While others looked at clouds and saw shapes, Hambleton saw systems, patterns, the invisible architecture of atmosphere. His office was a windowless room filled with machines that clicked and hummed. Teletype printers chattered constantly, spilling out data from weather stations across the region. Charts covered the walls, isobar maps, satellite images rendered in grainy black and white, tracking sheets marked with his careful handwriting. The air smelled of cigarette smoke, burnt coffee, and the particular mustiness of government buildings everywhere. Hambleton preferred this environment to almost any other. Here, the chaos of human interaction was replaced by the cleaner logic of meteorological systems. A cold front had no emotions. A pressure gradient didn't require small talk. The atmosphere, for all its complexity, followed rules. It made sense in ways that people often didn't. He lived alone in a modest apartment in Lakewood. He had been married once, briefly, in his 20s. She had left after 2 years, frustrated by his long hours, his distraction, his tendency to discuss dew points over dinner. There had been no children. His relationships since had been brief and unsatisfying. Women who initially found his intelligence attractive then grew weary of his inability to be fully present, to care about anything as much as he cared about the weather. He didn't blame them. He understood himself well enough to know his limitations. Some men were built for domesticity, for the warm chaos of family life. He was built for instruments and data, for the quiet satisfaction of accurate forecasting. But on the morning of January 23, 1978, as he sat at his desk drinking his 3rd cup of lukewarm coffee, John Hambleton felt something he rarely experienced: unease. The data coming in from the western stations was unusual, not unprecedented, but close. A powerful Arctic high-pressure system was pushing south from Canada, brutally cold air, the kind that made exposed skin dangerous within minutes. This alone was not remarkable. Canadian air masses swept south regularly during winter. But there was something else: a low-pressure system developing over the Ohio Valley, pulling moisture up from the Gulf of Mexico. Warm, wet air meeting Arctic cold. Again, not unusual in itself. The collision of air masses was the engine of all weather. What made Hambleton pause was the intensity of both systems and the speed at which they were converging. He spread the charts across his desk, tracing the projected paths with his finger. The low was deepening rapidly, losing pressure at a rate that suggested it would become a significant storm. The high was pushing south with unusual force and extent, and they were going to meet almost directly over the Great Lakes. He ran the calculations again, then again. The numbers remained consistent and increasingly alarming. His colleague, Dave Morrison, a younger meteorologist with more social grace and less experience, came in with fresh printouts. "You seeing this?" Morrison asked, dropping the papers on Hambleton's desk. Hambleton nodded slowly. "The merger happens here." He tapped the map over Indiana. "Wednesday night, early Thursday morning." "That's going to be a hell of a snowstorm," Morrison said. Hambleton looked up at him. "It's going to be more than that." By midday on the 24th, Hambleton had compiled his analysis. The storm would track northeast from the Ohio Valley, intensifying as it moved. The Arctic air would funnel behind it, creating a temperature differential of 50 degrees or more. The wind would be sustained at 30 to 40 miles per hour, with gusts potentially exceeding 60. And the snow would fall at rates of 2 to 3 inches per hour, possibly higher, in bands of enhanced precipitation. His forecast called for snowfall totals of 12 to 20 inches across much of Ohio, Indiana, and Michigan, with some areas potentially seeing more. But the real danger, he believed, would be the wind. The combination of heavy snow and high wind would create whiteout conditions, drifting that would make roads impassable, wind chills that would be life-threatening. He typed up his forecast and sent it through channels. Then he called the local television stations, spoke to the few contacts he had developed over the years. The response was polite but skeptical. Yes, a snowstorm was coming, but 12 to 20 inches? That seemed excessive. Wind gusts over 60? Doubtful. It was January in the Midwest. People expected snow. This forecast felt like hyperbole, the kind of thing that would make the weather service look foolish if it didn't materialize. "John," one station manager said, "I appreciate the heads up, but we can't panic people over every winter storm." Hambleton pressed his glasses up his nose, a habitual gesture when stressed. "This isn't every winter storm. We'll mention it in the evening forecast. Tell people to be cautious." It wasn't enough. Hambleton knew it wasn't enough. But he had done what he could. He had issued the warning. Whether people heeded it was beyond his control. He stayed late that night, alone in the office, watching the data continue to stream in. The systems were converging exactly as predicted. If anything, the storm was intensifying faster than his models suggested. At midnight, he left the building, drove home through streets that were already beginning to see the first flakes of snow. In his apartment, he didn't sleep well. He kept getting up, checking his own barometer, listening to the wind begin to rise. By dawn on January 25th, Hambleton was back in the office. Morrison was already there, looking tired and worried. "It's worse than we thought," Morrison said simply. The radar showed a massive comma-shaped system rotating over Indiana and Ohio. Snow was falling heavily across the entire region, but what concerned Hambleton most was the wind. The isobars on the pressure maps were tightly packed, indicating intense wind gradients. The Arctic high was pushing south with tremendous force, and the low was deepening still further, creating a pressure difference that was driving violent winds. Reports were already coming in. Interstate 75 closed in Ohio. I-69 shut down in Indiana. Zero visibility reported across multiple counties. The governor of Ohio was preparing to declare a state of emergency, and the storm was just beginning. Hambleton and his small team worked in shifts, but the shifts became meaningless. No one went home. They slept on office floors when they couldn't keep their eyes open anymore, woke stiff and disoriented, returned to the chattering machines and the constantly ringing phones. He issued update after update, each one more urgent than the last. Wind warnings, blizzard warnings, travel bans. Pleas for people to stay inside, to not attempt to drive, to understand that this was not a normal winter storm. The building itself began to struggle. Power flickered. The backup generators kicked in with a deep thrumming that could be felt through the floor. The heat became intermittent. Hambleton worked in his coat, his fingers stiff with cold as he marked up charts and fielded calls from emergency management officials. Outside the one small window in the break room, the world had disappeared. There was only white, a solid wall of wind-driven snow that made it impossible to see even the parking lot below. On the radio, which someone had brought in and kept tuned to the local news, reports began to come in of people stranded, vehicles abandoned, entire communities cut off. And then the first death, an elderly man in Toledo who had attempted to walk to a neighbor's house for help when his heat failed. They found him 50 feet from his door, frozen. Hambleton heard this and closed his eyes. He felt the weight of it, not responsibility exactly, because he had warned them, but grief nonetheless. This was what the numbers meant. This was the human translation of pressure gradients and temperature differentials. This was death written in the language of meteorology. The storm continued through that day and into the night and through the next day. Hambleton lost track of time in the windowless room with its artificial lights and constant noise. Day and night became meaningless. There was only the storm, tracking it, measuring it, reporting it, watching it unfold with the terrible precision that only hindsight allows. He ate sporadically, vending machine sandwiches, cold coffee, whatever someone brought back from the break room. His eyes burned from staring at screens and charts. His back ached from hunching over instruments. His voice grew hoarse from hours on the phone, repeating the same information to different officials, to media outlets, to anyone who called seeking information. Morrison worked beside him, silent mostly, efficiently processing data. They had developed a rhythm, Morrison handling the routine updates, Hambleton focusing on the larger analysis, on trying to predict when this would end. Because it would end. All storms did. The question was when and how much damage it would leave behind. The calls kept coming. A woman in Sandusky whose husband had left for work 2 days ago and hadn't returned. Could they tell her conditions in that area? Could they say when roads might reopen? Hambleton had no comfort to offer, only information. The roads were not passable. Visibility remained near zero, he was sorry. An emergency coordinator in Fort Wayne asking about the southern extent of the storm. They were trying to bring supplies up from Indianapolis. What route would be safest? Hambleton looked at his maps. There was no safe route. Everything was shut down. Everything. A hospital administrator in Toledo reporting that ambulances couldn't respond to calls. They had patients who needed emergency care. What should they do? Hambleton had no answer. He was a meteorologist, not a miracle worker. He could tell them about pressure systems and snowfall rates. He couldn't tell them how to save lives when the storm made movement impossible. On the evening of the second day, or was it the third? Hambleton wasn't sure anymore. The power went out completely. Not just a flicker this time, but total failure. The backup generators were buried beneath drifts of snow, their ventilation systems blocked. Emergency lights came on, dim and yellow, casting long shadows. The machines went silent. The constant chatter of teletype printers, which had become like white noise, suddenly stopped. In the eerie quiet, Hambleton could hear the wind outside screaming against the building. For the first time, he felt something close to panic. Without power, they had no data, no way to track the storm, no way to communicate with the network of stations. They were blind. Morrison began setting up battery-powered equipment, a small radio transmitter, a portable radar receiver that could at least pull in some satellite data. But it was fragmentary, incomplete. Hambleton stood and walked to the break room window. He pressed his face close to the glass, trying to see anything beyond the white chaos. Nothing, just the storm, infinite and consuming. How many people were out there right now, trapped in this? How many were cold, frightened, wondering if help would come? How many were beyond help already, claimed by the cold in lonely places where no one would find them until the snow melted weeks from now? He thought about his apartment, empty and dark. He thought about his ex-wife, wherever she was now, probably safe and warm with her new husband. He thought about all the choices he'd made that had led him to this windowless room in a darkened building, watching a storm he had predicted but could not prevent. "John," Morrison's voice behind him, "we've got the battery receiver working, new data coming in." Hambleton turned from the window, returned to the numbers. There was nothing else to do. The storm began to weaken on the morning of January 27th. Not suddenly. Weather systems don't work that way, but gradually. The pressure started to rise. The wind decreased from sustained gales to merely strong gusts. The snow, which had been falling relentlessly for more than 40 hours, began to taper to flurries. By noon, there were breaks in the clouds. Sunlight, filtered and pale, touched the buried landscape for the first time in days. Power was restored to the Weather Service building. The machines hummed back to life. Hambleton and Morrison, exhausted and disheveled, began compiling the final data. The numbers were staggering. Snowfall totals exceeded 20 inches across most of the affected region. Some places reported 30 inches or more. Drifts reached 10, 15, even 20 feet where the wind had concentrated the snow. Wind gusts had peaked at 79 miles per hour in Cleveland. The storm had killed at least 70 people across Ohio, Indiana, and Michigan, with numbers expected to rise as rescuers reached isolated areas. It was, by any measure, historic. The worst blizzard to hit the region in recorded history. Exactly what Hambleton had predicted, though he took no satisfaction in being right. The governor of Ohio called personally to thank him. Television stations requested interviews. The National Weather Service regional director sent a commendation. Hambleton declined the interviews. He wrote a brief technical summary of the storm for the official records. He filed his charts and data carefully so they would be available for future analysis. And then, on the evening of January 28th, when someone finally relieved him so he could go home, he walked out into the cold, clear air. The world was transformed. Streets were canyons carved through snow. Abandoned vehicles sat at strange angles, half-buried monuments to the attempt to travel. Rooftops sagged under impossible weight. Trees, stripped and broken, pointed skeletal fingers at the sky. But there was also light. Sunlight on snow, brilliant and almost painful to look at. The sky was a blue so deep and pure it seemed artificial. The air was crystalline, sharp in the lungs, utterly still after days of relentless wind. Hambleton stood in the parking lot of the Weather Service building for a long moment, just breathing, just looking. His car was somewhere under one of the mounds of snow. It didn't matter, he would walk. He needed to walk. The journey home took over an hour. The sidewalks were impassable, so he walked in the street, following the rough trails broken by early rescue vehicles. Other people were emerging too, bundled and blinking in the sudden brightness. They looked at each other with the recognition of shared trauma, nods, brief words of greeting, acknowledgement that they had all survived something significant. When Hambleton finally reached his apartment, he stood at the threshold for a moment before entering. Inside, it was cold. The heat had been off for days, but not as cold as outside, not as cold as it had been during the storm. He didn't bother taking off his coat. He simply sat down on his sofa and closed his eyes. He had done his job. He had seen it coming, had warned everyone he could, had tracked it through its terrible duration. He had given people information, the only thing he knew how to give. Whether it had been enough, whether it had saved even one life, he would never really know. What he knew was this. The atmosphere follows rules, but within those rules is chaos. You can predict a storm, but you cannot control it. You can warn people, but you cannot make them listen. You can measure death in pressure gradients, but that doesn't make it less real, less final. He thought about the man in Toledo who had died 50 feet from his door. So close to shelter, to warmth, to life. 50 feet. Had he heard the forecast? Had he understood the danger? Or had he, like so many, believed that he could manage, that it wouldn't be that bad, that nature's fury was something you could negotiate with? Hambleton opened his eyes. The apartment was dim, the winter light already fading. He should get up, start the radiator, make something to eat. But for now he sat in the cold and the quiet, feeling the weight of what had passed. Years later, 5 years, 10 years, it's hard to say exactly when, a young meteorologist named Sarah Chen would join the Cleveland office. Fresh from graduate school, enthusiastic and confident in the new technology that was revolutionizing weather prediction, she would be given a desk in the same room where Hambleton had worked. She would go through the old files, as young people sometimes do, curious about the history of the place. And she would find, in a locked drawer of what had been Hambleton's desk, a folder containing the pressure logs from January 1978. They were handwritten, Hambleton's precise notation, every reading carefully recorded. But there was something else in the margins, in that same careful hand, notes that weren't technical. Called Mary Thompson, husband missing, no comfort to give. Toledo Hospital, ambulances stranded. Death toll rising. And then at the bottom of the final page, a single sentence. We can see them coming. We cannot stop them. Chen would sit at that desk, holding those pages, understanding something about the man who had worked there before her. Understanding that behind every forecast, every warning, every percentage chance of precipitation were people. People who would be cold or warm, safe or in danger, alive or dead, based on decisions made with imperfect information about an imperfect science. She would carefully return the papers to their folder, place it back in the drawer, and turn to her computer screen, to the satellite data streaming in real time, to the powerful models that could now predict with accuracy that Hambleton could only have dreamed of. And she would think, we've gotten better at seeing them coming, but we still cannot stop them. John Hambleton retired in 1985 at age 62 after nearly 30 years with the National Weather Service. There was a small ceremony, a plaque, a modest pension. He moved to Arizona seeking warmth perhaps, or simply distance from the scene of his life's work. He died in 1992 of heart failure, alone in a rented apartment in Tucson. The obituary in the Cleveland Plain Dealer was 3 paragraphs long. It mentioned his career, his role in forecasting the Great Blizzard of 1978, his years of service. It did not mention that he had never married, had no children, had few close friends. It did not mention the nights he couldn't sleep, replaying the storm in his mind, wondering what more he could have done. But in the meteorological community, among those who understood what he had accomplished, his name was remembered. The forecast he issued on January 24, 1978 was studied, analyzed, held up as an example of how good forecasting, even in the era before sophisticated computer models, could save lives. Because lives had been saved, not all. 70 deaths was 70 too many. But without the warnings, without the travel bans issued based on his forecast, without the preparation his predictions allowed, it would have been hundreds, thousands perhaps. The storm had killed, but it had not killed as many as it might have. And that difference, the lives saved by advance warning, by people who heard the forecast and stayed home, who stocked supplies, who didn't travel, that difference was Hambleton's legacy. He would never know the specific people whose lives his forecast saved. They would never know to thank him. But they existed. Fathers who came home to their families, children who grew up, Entire futures that unfolded because someone with careful hands and tired eyes sat in a windowless room and read the language of the atmosphere correctly. Now, decades later, when meteorologists gather for conferences, when they discuss historic storms and the evolution of forecasting technology, the Great Blizzard of 1978 is always mentioned. And so is John Hambleton, not with drama, not with grand pronouncements, but with the quiet respect afforded to someone who did his job well in difficult circumstances, who saw what was coming and spoke up, who stayed at his post through the storm, tracking it, reporting it, serving as a link between the chaos outside and the people trying to survive it. The photographs of him show a man who looked unremarkable, which is to say, he looked like most of us. Not heroic in bearing, not commanding in presence. Just a person doing his job, using the skills he had developed over a lifetime of patient study, trying to be useful in a world that didn't always listen. And perhaps that's the most important part of his story. Not that he was special, but that he was ordinary. That his power came not from charisma or authority, but from attention, from paying careful attention to data, to patterns, to the subtle signals that the atmosphere sends before it unleashes its fury. In an age of instant communication and sophisticated forecasting technology, it's easy to forget how recent our mastery is, how fragile our understanding remains. We can see storms forming halfway around the world now. We can track them to the minute, but we still cannot control them. We still cannot protect everyone in their path. We can only watch and warn and hope that the warnings are heeded. That was John Hambleton's work. That was his life. And on those cold winter nights, when the wind begins to rise and the sky turns that particular shade of grey that means snow is coming, somewhere a meteorologist sits in front of screens and instruments, reading the data, making calculations, preparing forecasts, carrying on the work that Hambleton began, maintaining the vigil that he kept. The storms still come. The atmosphere still follows its ancient patterns, but we watch. We warn. We remember. And sometimes in the margins of our notes, in the quiet moments between forecasts, we think of those who came before us. Ordinary people who did extraordinary work, who saved lives they never met, who kept the vigil through the worst of it. We think of John Hambleton sitting in his windowless room, glasses sliding down his nose, marking his careful notations, reading the sky through numbers, seeing the storm before it arrived, watching, warning, waiting. That is the work. That has always been the work. Let us drift now from the human story into something stranger, more expansive, the way snow itself becomes a keeper of time, a preserver of moments, a medium through which the past speaks to us in whispers. In Greenland, far from the cities buried by the blizzard of 1978, scientists drill into ice that has been accumulating for millennia. The drill descends slowly, carefully, extracting cores that are cylinders of frozen time. Each layer represents a year, sometimes a season, sometimes, in the case of significant events, a single storm. The ice remembers everything. Dust from volcanic eruptions centuries past, ash from forest fires that burned when Columbus sailed, chemical signatures of industrialization, nuclear testing, the slow accumulation of human impact on the atmosphere, and storms, especially storms. Each major weather event leaves its trace in the density of the ice, in the ratio of oxygen isotopes, in the tiny air bubbles trapped like memories in crystal. Somewhere in those cores, preserved in ice that will outlast nations and languages, is the signature of January 1978. The moisture that rose from the Gulf of Mexico met Arctic air over the Great Lakes, fell as snow across millions of square miles. Some of it reached Greenland, some of it became ice, some of it became permanent. In this way, the blizzard that terrorized the Midwest for those few days in winter has been made eternal. Long after everyone who experienced it has died, long after the last photograph has faded and the last story has been forgotten, the ice will remember. silent, patient, waiting for someone with the right instruments to read its story. There is something both comforting and unsettling about this. Our sufferings preserved, our struggles archived. The storm that seemed endless in the moment, reduced to a thin line in ancient ice, no more or less significant than the 1,000 other storms before and after. Time collapses in ice. The present becomes the past, becomes geology. And all of it eventually melts. Each snowflake that fell during those days in January was unique. This is not merely poetic, but mathematically true. The crystalline structure of ice, the way water molecules bond in hexagonal patterns, allows for such tremendous variation that no two snowflakes in the history of the planet have ever been identical. Think about that for a moment. Every flake that touched your face during the storm, every flake that accumulated on your roof and windows and car, every single crystal in the billions upon billions that fell, each one was an individual expression of physics and chance, a temporary sculpture of frozen water that would never be exactly repeated. They formed in the clouds high above the chaos below, where supercooled water droplets encountered dust particles or ice crystals and began to freeze. As each crystal fell through the atmosphere, its shape was determined by temperature and humidity gradients it encountered. A slight change in temperature, even a fraction of a degree, would alter the pattern of growth. More humidity here, and the arms would branch differently. Less cold there, and the crystal would develop plates instead of needles. By the time each flake reached the ground, it had traveled through a unique path, encountered unique conditions, and arrived with a unique structure. And then it landed, and within seconds or minutes, the individual identity was lost. It merged with millions of others, the boundaries dissolved, the unique became the collective. Perhaps there is a metaphor there. We are all distinct, shaped by the unique conditions of our passage through life. And yet we land together, merge together, become part of something larger that erases our individuality, even as it's built from it. The drifts that trapped people in their homes were made of individuals, billions of unique snowflakes pressed together by wind, by weight, by circumstance. The beauty was buried beneath the burden. The mathematics became disaster. In the oldest stories that humans tell, winter is never just winter. It is always metaphor, always symbol, always something more than frozen water and dark days. The Norse spoke of Fimbulwinter, the great winter that would precede Ragnarok, the end of the world. 3 winters would come in succession without summer between them. The sun would be swallowed, the stars would vanish, snow would fall from all directions, and cold winds would howl. Brother would fight brother. The bonds of kinship would dissolve. And in that endless winter, the world would prepare for its final battle. Perhaps the people trapped in the blizzard of 1978, as they watched the snow pile higher and the days blur together, felt an echo of that ancient fear. The fear that winter would not end, that the cold had become permanent, that the world as they knew it was over. The Inuit peoples of the Arctic, who lived with winter as a constant companion rather than a seasonal visitor, developed a complex vocabulary for snow and ice. They had words for snow that falls slowly, snow that falls quickly, snow that drifts, snow that forms into specific shapes, snow that is good for building, snow that is dangerous to walk on. Each word represented not just observation, but survival knowledge, the ability to read the white landscape and understand its moods, its dangers, its gifts. In their stories, winter was personified as Sedna, the goddess of the sea, whose anger could freeze the ocean and send storms to punish those who violated the old ways. When hunters took too much, when they disrespected the animals they killed, when they forgot the rituals that maintained balance, Sedna would withdraw her blessing. The fish would disappear, the seals would hide, and the storms would come. To appease her, shamans would have to journey to the bottom of the sea in trance states, comb the tangles from her hair, soothe her anger, and beg her to release the animals again. Only then would the storms cease. Only then would life return to normal. Perhaps we still do this in our way. When winter becomes too fierce, when storms devastate us, we look for reasons. We ask what we did wrong. We wonder if this is punishment for our transgressions, pollution, climate change, our general disregard for the natural world. We seek ways to appease forces we don't fully understand. We comb the tangles from the goddess's hair and call it meteorology. There is a phenomenon that occurs during and after major snowstorms that psychologists have studied, though they don't fully understand it. People report hearing sounds that aren't there. Not hallucinations exactly, more like the mind filling in the blanks created by extreme sensory deprivation. During the blizzard, when visibility dropped to zero and the world became a uniform white, when the howling wind provided the only constant sound, people reported hearing voices in the storm, their names being called, conversations just at the edge of hearing, footsteps approaching that never arrived. This wasn't madness, it was the brain trying to make sense of chaos, trying to find pattern in the absence of pattern. The auditory cortex, deprived of its usual input, the varied sounds of human civilization, traffic, music, the complex acoustic environment we usually inhabit, began to generate its own signals. Some reported hearing music, others heard crying, some heard laughter. The sounds were always just indistinct enough that you couldn't be certain what you were hearing, but distinct enough that you couldn't dismiss it as pure imagination. After the storm, when the snow had stopped, but the world remained buried and silent, a different kind of auditory strangeness emerged. The silence itself became overwhelming. Snow absorbs sound. The soft, porous structure of fresh snow is one of nature's best acoustic dampeners. With feet of snow covering everything, the usual ambient noise of the world, traffic, industry, even natural sounds, was muffled into near total quiet. People who ventured outside in those first days after the storm reported an almost spiritual quality to the silence. You could hear your own heartbeat. Your breath seemed thunderously loud. Speaking felt like shouting, though you were using a normal voice. And in that silence, some reported hearing things from far away. Conversations from blocks away carrying clearly through the still, cold air. The sound of a shovel hitting pavement miles distant. Church bells from towns that should have been too far away to hear. Sound traveled differently through the post-storm landscape. The normal acoustic barriers were removed. The snow reflected and channeled sound in unexpected ways. The cold, dense air transmitted vibrations more efficiently. But it felt like magic. It felt like the world had been transformed into something other than itself, a place where the normal rules didn't apply, where distance and proximity were measured differently, where silence could be so complete that it became its own kind of sound. In the weeks after the blizzard, as the snow slowly melted, the landscape revealed its secrets. Things that had been lost were found. Car keys dropped months ago appeared in parking lots. Toys from the previous autumn emerged from front yards. Small objects of daily life, forgotten or misplaced, returned as the white blanket pulled back. But there were stranger discoveries too. In Cleveland, the melting snow exposed a woman's body in an alley behind a warehouse. She had been there since November, police determined, murdered and left there, covered by the first snows of winter, then buried so completely by the blizzard that she had been invisible for months. The snow had preserved her, protected her from scavengers and decay. When spring came early that year, hastened by the unusually warm March, she was revealed, and a case that might never have been solved was opened again. In rural Ohio, the snowmelt revealed that a barn had collapsed under the weight of the drifts. Inside were 3 cows, frozen in the positions they had been in when the roof came down. The farmer had been unable to reach them during the storm. By the time he could dig through to the barn, weeks later, they were already gone. But the snow had preserved them so perfectly that they looked as if they might wake up if you called to them. Abandoned cars appeared in the strangest places, not on roads, those had been cleared, but in fields, in streams, in places that made no sense until you remembered the whiteout conditions, the way people had become disoriented, turned off roads they thought were still beneath them, drove until they couldn't drive anymore, and then simply stopped. Some of these cars were empty. Others contained people who had not survived. They were found sitting in the driver's seat, the engine long since out of gas, the battery dead, the interior filled with the particular cold that comes from prolonged exposure. They had frozen quietly, alone, waiting for help that couldn't come. The snow had covered them, had hidden them, had preserved them in their final moments. And then, when its work was done, when winter loosened its grip, it revealed them again. Offerings returned to the world, evidence of what had passed. There is a technique, ancient and well documented, for memorization called the method of loci, or the memory palace. You imagine a building, room by room, and place the things you want to remember in specific locations within those rooms. To recall the information, you simply walk through the palace in your mind, visiting each location and retrieving what you placed there. In a sense, the landscape after a blizzard becomes a kind of involuntary memory palace. Every drift, every snow-covered landmark, every buried object becomes a location associated with the memory of the storm. Years later, people who lived through the blizzard of 1978 would report that certain places, a particular intersection, a specific hill, a stretch of highway, would trigger immediate recall of where they were during the storm, what they felt, what they saw. The landscape holds memory. Not consciously, not intentionally, but through the associations we build. The gas station where you ran out of fuel trying to get home, the school where you sheltered for 3 days, the hospital where your child was born during the storm, delivered by candlelight when the power failed. These places become more than places. They become chapters in the story you tell about the time you survived. And even decades later, driving past them, you remember the fear, the cold, the strange compression of time that made 3 days feel like 3 weeks, the relief when it finally ended. Memory is like snow in this way. It accumulates in layers, covering what came before, transforming the landscape of the past into something both familiar and strange. And sometimes, if conditions are right, if you dig down through the layers, you can find things you thought were lost. Moments preserved perfectly, emotions frozen in crystal, the exact quality of light on a particular afternoon when the storm finally broke and the sun emerged. But memory, unlike ice cores, is unstable. It changes each time we access it. Details shift. Emotions are reinterpreted through the lens of present circumstance. The storm gets worse in the retelling, or better, or stranger. We add details we couldn't have known. We remove details that don't fit the narrative we've constructed. In this way, the blizzard of 1978 has become mythological, even for those who lived through it. The snow was deeper than it actually was. The cold was colder. The isolation more complete. The danger more dramatic. This isn't dishonesty, it's the nature of memory. We preserve what matters, and what matters is not always what happened, but what it felt like, how it changed us, what it taught us about ourselves and our fragility. In the months after the storm, something unexpected happened in the artistic communities of the Midwest. Painters, photographers, sculptors, people who made things, who imposed order and meaning on materials, found themselves drawn to the imagery of the blizzard. But they weren't depicting the drama of the storm. They weren't painting whiteout conditions or buried cars or desperate rescues. Instead, they were painting the whiteness itself, the erasure, the absence. Canvases appeared in galleries that were almost entirely white, not blank, but filled with subtle variations of white, off-white, cream, the palest blues and greys. Looking at them was like looking at snow. At first they seemed empty, but as you studied them, you began to see texture, depth, complexity within the apparent simplicity. Photographers took images of the post-storm landscape, horizonless expanses where earth and sky merged into a single white continuum. Buried objects that were just vague suggestions of form beneath smooth snow. Close-ups of ice crystals that looked like alien architecture. Sculptors made pieces using snow itself as material, knowing they were creating art that would vanish, that could only exist temporarily, that was meant to melt and be forgotten. They built forms that the wind would eventually destroy, that the sun would erase. Art as meditation on impermanence. There was something in this that spoke to the experience of the storm. The way it had erased the familiar landscape. The way it had reduced the complex world to simple elements, cold, white, survival. The way it had reminded everyone that all our constructions, physical, social, psychological, were temporary, subject to forces beyond our control. One artist, a sculptor from Ann Arbor named Margaret Chen, created a series of pieces she called the architecture of absence. They were hollow forms, negative space defined by thin shells of translucent material. You looked at them and saw what wasn't there, the empty centers, the missing pieces, the spaces where something should be, but wasn't. In an interview years later, she explained, "The storm took things away. It took mobility, connection, certainty. It left behind these absences. I wanted to give shape to that feeling of something missing, something removed, something that used to be there but isn't anymore." The work was difficult to look at, not because it was disturbing, but because it required you to see differently, to focus on the absence rather than the presence, to notice what wasn't there. Perhaps that's what the blizzard taught, to pay attention to absence, to notice when the usual noise of the world goes silent, to feel the weight of emptiness, to understand that nothing is as powerful as nothing, that the removal of something can be more profound than its presence. In the years following the blizzard, therapists across the affected region reported an unusual pattern. Patients who had lived through the storm, even those who had not been particularly traumatized by it, reported recurring dreams involving snow, cold, and burial. The dreams varied, but certain themes appeared again and again, being trapped in a house as snow rose to cover the windows, searching for someone in a whiteout, walking through infinite white landscapes with no landmarks, no direction, no end, being buried alive in snow, unable to move, unable to breathe, the weight pressing down. These weren't nightmares exactly. Most people describe them as unsettling rather than terrifying, strange rather than horrific. The emotional tone was more of unease, of something being not quite right, than of active fear. Dream researchers suggested that the mind was still processing the experience, integrating the extreme sensory deprivation, the disruption of normal routines, the existential recognition of vulnerability that the storm had forced. The dreams were a kind of digestion, a way of metabolizing the experience and incorporating it into the psyche's understanding of the world. But there was another interpretation, less scientific but perhaps more interesting. The dreams might be ancestral memory awakening. For most of human history, winter was the greatest threat to survival. Our ancestors died by the thousands when the cold came, when food ran out, when shelter failed. We carry that memory in our genes, in the deep structures of the brain that evolved long before language or consciousness. The blizzard of 1978 might have awakened that ancient fear, reminded us that we are, despite all our technology and infrastructure, still vulnerable to weather, still at the mercy of systems we cannot control, still fundamentally animals trying to stay warm enough to survive until spring. The dreams were that recognition working itself out in the symbolic language of the unconscious, the white landscapes, the cold that seeps into everything, the sense of being small and lost in something vast and indifferent. One psychologist, Dr. Ellen Rothstein, who practiced in Toledo, collected hundreds of these dream reports. She published a paper in 1982 titled The Archetypal Winter: Dream Imagery Following Environmental Trauma. In it, she argued that major weather events function as initiations, experiences that force us to confront fundamental truths about existence, about our relationship to nature, about mortality. The blizzard, she wrote, stripped away the comfortable illusion of control. It reminded us that we are not separate from nature, not protected from it by our technology and infrastructure. We are part of it, subject to it. And this recognition, this forced remembering, creates psychological ripples that extend far beyond the event itself. Her work was largely ignored by the mainstream psychological community. Too poetic, too philosophical, not empirical enough. But years later, after other disasters, other events that forced entire populations to confront their vulnerability, hurricanes, earthquakes, pandemics, her framework would be revisited, and people would recognize that she had been describing something real. That collective trauma creates collective dreams. That the psyche has ways of processing shared experience that transcend individual consciousness. The blizzard became a dream that an entire region shared, a symbol that resonated in ways that were felt rather than understood, a metaphor that the unconscious mind kept returning to, kept trying to integrate, kept using to express other fears and anxieties. Even now, decades later, there are people who still dream of snow, who wake in the middle of the night with the sense of being buried, of cold pressing in, of wind howling at the edges of consciousness. The dream life of the storm continues long after the physical snow has melted, long after the last drift has disappeared. Memory, like water, changes form but never truly vanishes. It evaporates, condenses, falls again as something new. There is a paradox at the heart of memory studies. We remember traumatic events more vividly than mundane ones. The emotional intensity seems to etch them more deeply into our neural architecture. And yet those same intense memories are often the most distorted, the most subject to revision and reconstruction. People who lived through the blizzard of 1978 remember it clearly. Ask them about it and they can tell you stories. Where they were when it started, how long they were trapped, what they ate, how they stayed warm. The details seem crisp, immediate, certain. But research into memory accuracy suggests that many of those details are wrong. Not intentionally, not lies, but reconstructions. The mind filling in gaps with plausible information, merging memories from different moments, incorporating details heard in others' stories, creating a coherent narrative from fragments of actual experience. One study, conducted in 1985 by researchers at Ohio State University, interviewed 200 people who had lived through the storm. They asked detailed questions about their experiences, what time the power went out, how much food they had, what they could see from their windows, how they communicated with others. Then they compared these recollections with contemporaneous records, weather service logs, power company outage reports, photographs taken during the storm, diary entries written at the time. The discrepancies were significant. Power outages that people remembered lasting 3 days actually lasted 8 hours. Food supplies remembered as nearly exhausted were actually adequate. Views from windows described as complete whiteout showed, in photographs, clear visibility of nearby structures. This doesn't mean people were lying or that their memories were entirely false. It means that memory is reconstructive rather than reproductive. We don't retrieve experiences like playing back a video. We reconstruct them each time we remember, And each reconstruction is influenced by present knowledge, subsequent experiences, stories we've heard, and the narrative we've built about who we are and what we've survived. The blizzard in memory is not the same as the blizzard in fact. The memory blizzard is more dramatic, more dangerous, more transformative. It has to be, because memory serves narrative purposes. We don't remember to preserve historical accuracy. We remember to make meaning. And the meaning people made of the blizzard of 1978 was profound. It was the time they survived something extraordinary, the time they proved their resilience, the time they learned what they were capable of enduring. Whether the actual details align perfectly with the recorded facts is less important than what the memory does, how it functions in the ongoing story of self. Perhaps this is the final mystery of snow, not just how it falls or what it preserves, but how it transforms in memory, how the cold becomes colder, the white becomes whiter, the isolation becomes more complete. How winter, once survived, becomes the story we tell about who we were before and who we became after. And now, in this late hour, as you listen to these words, perhaps you can feel something of what those people felt. Not the cold, you were warm, comfortable, safe. Not the fear, you know how the story ends, that spring came, that life resumed, but perhaps you can feel the strangeness of it. The way a familiar world can become alien so quickly. The way time can distort under pressure. The way we are always, all of us, so much more vulnerable than we like to believe. The blizzard of 1978 is gone. The snow melted decades ago. The people who lived through it are aging, and soon enough there will be no living memory of that white week in January. It will become pure history, data points, and archived photographs and academic papers about storm systems and emergency response, but something remains. In the ice cores of Greenland, in the dream life of a region, in the stories still told around tables when the weather turns bad and someone says, "This is nothing, you should have seen 78. In the quiet recognition shared among survivors of any great storm that nature is patient, powerful, and utterly indifferent to our plans. That the world can stop, that cold can kill. That survival sometimes comes down to nothing more than luck, preparation, and the stubborn refusal to surrender. The snow remembers in its way, the ice remembers, the land remembers in the shape of trees that broke and regrew, in the patterns of drainage where drifts melted, in the small ways that landscape bears witness to what passed over it. And we remember, though imperfectly, though the details blur and shift with each retelling. We remember the white, the cold, the wind, the waiting. We remember that we survived. And in remembering, we prepare, though we don't always know it, for the next storm, the next time the world stops, the next test of our fragility and strength. The snow will come again. It always does. And when it comes, we will face it with whatever grace we can manage, knowing that winter, like all things, is temporary, knowing that spring, however delayed, however impossible it seems in the depths of January, is patient too, and always, eventually, arrives. Let us shift our attention now gently to a different experience of the same storm, to those who watched from above, who commanded from safety, who experienced the blizzard not as survival, but as spectacle, inconvenience, or professional challenge. On the 15th floor of the State Office Building in Columbus, Ohio, Governor James Rhodes stood at a window and looked out at the whiteness consuming his state. The glass was triple-paned, sealed against the cold. Behind him, in the wood-paneled conference room, aides and emergency coordinators gathered around a map studded with colored pins, each one representing a crisis, a need, a request for help that couldn't yet be answered. The governor was 70 years old, a veteran of political battles and economic crises, a man who had governed Ohio twice before, and had returned to the office through a combination of nostalgia and necessity. He was not easily rattled. He had seen strikes, riots, recessions. But this was different. "How many dead?" he asked, not turning from the window. 16 confirmed so far in Ohio, someone replied. "But communications are down across most of the state. The number will rise." Rhodes nodded slowly. Below him, the streets of Columbus were buried. Abandoned cars dotted the landscape like modern sculpture. But the building he stood in had power, backup generators humming in the basement, enough fuel to last for weeks. The heat worked, the phones worked. Coffee was being made in the break room. Sandwiches had been ordered from a catering service that somehow, impossibly, had managed to deliver. He and his staff were comfortable. Not comfortable like being at home, but comfortable enough. They could work, they could coordinate, they could make decisions that would affect millions of people who were, at that moment, sitting in cold houses eating canned soup, wondering if help was coming. "What's the National Guard's status?" Rhodes asked. "Mobilized, but they can't move. The armories are snowed in. Some units are trapped in their own facilities." The governor turned from the window. "Can't move," he repeated. "The National Guard can't move, in Ohio." There was a weight to his voice, not anger exactly, but something close to it. The recognition of powerlessness. He had activated the emergency response system. He had declared a state of emergency. He had done everything that governors do in crisis. And yet the state remained paralyzed. Power, he was learning, was a function of mobility. And in a blizzard, no one was mobile. In the wealthy suburbs of Cleveland, Shaker Heights, Bay Village, Gates Mills, the storm was experienced differently than in the working-class neighborhoods of the city's east side. Not because the snow fell less heavily there, or the wind blew less fiercely, but because privilege creates buffers. The large homes had multiple heating systems, furnaces, yes, but also fireplaces, sometimes several of them, with wood stacked neatly in storage rooms or attached garages. When the power failed, as it did everywhere, the wealthy lit fires and stayed warm. Their pantries were better stocked, not out of conscious preparation, but simply because they had more space, more money, more of everything. Shelves of canned goods, freezers full of meat, wine cellars. The isolation was uncomfortable, certainly, but not life-threatening. Many had generators, not industrial backup systems, but portable units purchased for summer cottages or boats, brought out now and connected to essential circuits. Enough to run a refrigerator, a few lights, a radio, enough to maintain a semblance of normal life. And when the storm finally broke, when roads began to be cleared, they were cleared first in the wealthy neighbourhoods. Not officially, no one issued such an order. But the snow removal equipment was concentrated where it was most politically valuable, where the people who called city councillors and knew the mayor lived. In Shaker Heights, a community of large homes and old money, the main roads were passable within 2 days. Residents could drive, carefully, slowly, to grocery stores that had reopened, to gas stations that had power. On East 55th Street, in the predominantly black and working-class neighborhood of Central, the streets remained impassable for a week. No plows came. Residents dug out their own blocks, forming volunteer crews, sharing shovels, clearing paths by hand. When grocery stores ran out of food, there were no alternatives. When heat failed, there were no backup systems. The same storm, the same city, two entirely different experiences. No one called this injustice, at least not officially. It was explained as a matter of resources, of priority roads, of practical decision-making under difficult circumstances. But the pattern was clear and it was old. In crisis, as in calm, the comfortable remained comfortable and the vulnerable became more vulnerable. In Michigan, at the Emergency Operations Center in Lansing, officials worked around the clock coordinating response. They had maps, communications equipment, direct lines to the governor's office. They had authority, information, and a clear sense of mission. But they also had frustration. Every decision they made ran into the same implacable obstacle, the storm itself. They could issue orders, but those orders couldn't be executed. They could deploy resources, but those resources couldn't reach where they were needed. On the second day of the storm, a call came in from a small town in the Upper Peninsula. The caller, a deputy sheriff, reported that the local hospital was running out of oxygen for patients on respirators. They needed an emergency supply immediately. The coordinator taking the call assured him that help was coming. She flagged the request as urgent, routed it to the appropriate department. Within an hour, arrangements were made. Oxygen tanks would be loaded onto a National Guard truck and delivered. But the truck couldn't move. The roads were closed. The snow was too deep. The wind was too strong. The coordinator called the hospital back. "We're working on it," she said. "We're trying to get a helicopter, but the weather—" "They'll die," the deputy interrupted. His voice was steady, factual. "Without oxygen, the patients will die." "When?" "We're doing everything we can." "When?" he asked again. She had no answer. The resources existed, the will existed, but the storm negated both. The patients in that small hospital were beyond help, not because no one cared, but because nature had made help impossible. Later, she would learn that the hospital staff had improvised, rationing oxygen, manually ventilating patients when the supply ran out, keeping people alive through sheer determination and improvisation until the storm passed and resupply became possible. No one died, but it was a near thing. The woman who took that call would remember it for years, the feeling of helplessness, of being inside a warm, well-lit command center with every resource of government behind her and still being unable to help. The illusion of control exposed as exactly that, an illusion. In television studios across the region, anchors delivered the news of the storm to audiences that included both those experiencing it and those watching from safety. The tone was carefully calibrated, serious enough to convey the gravity of the situation, but not so alarming as to cause panic. The anchors themselves were comfortable. The studios had power, heat, food. Between broadcasts, they drank coffee and made phone calls to check on family members. They were professionals doing a job, performing a role. On screen, they spoke of developing situations and emergency conditions. They showed footage of snow-covered streets, abandoned vehicles, rescue operations. The images were dramatic, but also oddly sanitized. The camera framed the chaos, but didn't capture the fear, the cold, the desperate boredom of being trapped. One anchor, a woman named Patricia Myers, who worked for a Cleveland station, would later write about the cognitive dissonance of the experience. "I was telling people not to go outside, that conditions were life-threatening, while sitting in a climate-controlled studio wearing a dress and heels. The disconnect was surreal. I was narrating a disaster I wasn't experiencing." The broadcasts served a purpose. They provided information, reassurance, a sense of connection, but they also created a kind of theatre. The storm became a story, and stories have narrative arcs. They have drama, tension, resolution. They have heroes, the plow drivers, the emergency responders, the ordinary people who helped their neighbors. What they often didn't show was the mundane reality. The hours of sitting in the cold with nothing to do. The anxiety about money lost from missed work. The particular stress of being trapped with family members in a small space. The way boredom and discomfort erode the spirit more effectively than any single dramatic moment. The media made the storm comprehensible. They gave it a shape, a meaning. But in doing so, they also made it less real. They transformed lived experience into spectacle. For the executives of major corporations headquartered in the affected region, the blizzard presented a different kind of challenge, not survival, but business continuity. At the headquarters of TRW in Cleveland, Senior management held conference calls from their homes, most of which retained power longer than average, located as they were in the better-maintained neighbourhoods. They discussed the impact on operations, on quarterly projections, on shareholder value. The factory workers, meanwhile, the people who actually made the products that generated the profits, were trapped at home, or worse, trapped in the factories where they'd been working when the storm hit. Some companies had arranged for cots and food when it became clear that workers couldn't leave. Others hadn't been so prepared. At one automotive parts plant in Toledo, 300 workers were stranded for 2 days with minimal food and no heat after the power failed. They huddled in the break rooms, sharing the contents of vending machines. When they finally were able to leave, they received their regular pay for the hours worked before the storm hit, but nothing additional for the time they'd been trapped. The executives who made that decision did so from home offices, never having experienced the cold, the fear, or the indignity of being abandoned by an employer they'd given years of labor to. Some companies responded better. A few demonstrated genuine concern for employee welfare, arranged for emergency housing, provided extra compensation, covered food and heating costs. But these were the exceptions. For most corporations, the storm was primarily a logistical inconvenience, a threat to productivity and profit. One CEO, speaking to investors after the storm, actually praised the silver lining of the disaster. Inventory that couldn't be delivered to customers could be held and sold later, potentially at higher prices as demand exceeded supply. The human cost wasn't mentioned in the call. Years later, labor organizers would point to the blizzard as a crystallizing moment, evidence of how little worker welfare mattered compared to business interests. The storm had revealed the truth. Workers were resources to be managed, not people to be protected. Universities, hospitals, government buildings, these institutions weathered the storm with relative ease. They had emergency protocols, they had backup systems, they had, most importantly, the resources that come with institutional scale. At Ohio State University, students who had remained on campus for the break found themselves well cared for. The dormitories had heat and power from the central plant. The dining halls remained open. There was food, warmth, and community. Some students would later describe the storm as almost festive, a break from normal routine, a shared adventure, an excuse to have extended conversations and impromptu parties. They were experiencing the same storm that was killing people across the state. But their experience was fundamentally different because they were protected by institutional infrastructure. At Cleveland Clinic, one of the nation's premier hospitals, operations continued with minimal interruption. The facility had backup generators large enough to power a small city. When the surrounding neighborhood went dark, the hospital remained a beacon of light and warmth. Staff who couldn't go home were provided with sleeping quarters, meals, clean clothes. Patients continued to receive world-class care. A few miles away at a small community hospital in a working-class neighborhood, the situation was far more dire. Their backup generator failed on the first day. They had enough diesel fuel for maybe 12 hours even if they could get it working. Staff worked by flashlight. They manually pumped oxygen. They kept newborns warm by wrapping them in blankets and holding them. Both were hospitals. Both saved lives during the storm. But one did so with every modern resource available, while the other relied on the desperate ingenuity of exhausted staff. The disparity wasn't planned. It was simply the accumulated result of decades of investment decisions, of resources flowing towards centers of wealth and power, of systems designed to protect what was already strong rather than support what was vulnerable. In the upscale restaurant district of Ann Arbor, Michigan, one establishment, the Chop House, remained open throughout the storm. The owner and several staff members had been there when the blizzard hit and decided to wait it out. They had food in the walk-in coolers, they had wine in the cellar, they had a gas stove that worked without electricity. For 3 days, a group of about 20 people, staff and customers who'd been dining when travel became impossible, sheltered together in unexpected intimacy. They made meals from the restaurant's inventory, they told stories, they played cards by candlelight, they slept in the booths and on the floor. Years later, several of them would describe it as one of the most memorable experiences of their lives. An adventure, a bonding moment, the time they were trapped in a fine restaurant during the blizzard. They had been lucky, they acknowledged, lucky to be trapped somewhere with food, heat, and company. Lucky to have the storm become a story they could tell at parties rather than a trauma they needed to overcome. Compare this to the experience of Maria Santos, a cleaning woman who worked in the office buildings of downtown Toledo. She had been on her shift when the storm hit. Her supervisor had told her and the other cleaning staff to leave early, but by the time she got to the bus stop, buses had stopped running. She tried to walk home, a distance of about 3 miles, but the snow was already too deep, the wind too strong. She took shelter in a gas station, spent 2 nights there, huddled with several other stranded workers, sharing the few snacks available from the limited store inventory. No heat after the power failed, no comfortable booths or wine cellars, just the cold and waiting and the particular humiliation of being trapped in circumstances that revealed just how precarious her existence was. When she finally made it home, she found her apartment frigid, the heat had failed, and she didn't have a fireplace or backup system. She spent another 2 days wearing every piece of clothing she owned, melting snow for water, eating crackers because the stores in her neighborhood hadn't reopened yet. She didn't tell stories about this at parties. She didn't describe it as an adventure. It was simply something she endured, another hardship in a life that had offered many hardships. The blizzard didn't create inequality. It simply revealed it, made visible the vast differences in how people experience the same event based on their economic circumstances, their location, their access to resources. In the aftermath of the storm, as the full scope of the damage became clear, charitable organizations mobilized. The Red Cross opened emergency shelters, churches organized food drives, local businesses donated supplies. The wealthy donated generously, writing checks, organizing fundraisers, appearing in newspaper photographs presenting oversized checks to relief organizations. Their generosity was real and it helped, but it was also comfortable. They could donate from abundance. The money they gave didn't diminish their own security or comfort. Some of them received tax deductions for their donations, turning charity into a kind of investment, a way to feel good while also deriving financial benefit. None of this is to diminish the value of the help provided. People were fed, housed, warmed because of these donations. But the dynamic was revealing. The same storm that devastated some merely inconvenienced others, who then received social credit for helping those who had suffered what they themselves had not. One wealthy suburb organized a blizzard relief gala 2 months after the storm. Tickets were $500 per person. The event was held at a country club. People wore evening gowns and tuxedos. They ate catered meals and danced to a live band. The event raised $50,000 for storm relief, which was lauded as a tremendous success. At the same time, in the neighborhoods where people had actually suffered during the storm, recovery was still ongoing. Roofs remained damaged, pipes remained broken, bills remained unpaid. The $50,000 helped some of them, but the contrast was stark. The wealthy celebrating their charity while the affected were still dealing with the consequences. This wasn't unique to the blizzard of 1978. It was the same pattern that plays out after every disaster. The vulnerable suffer, the comfortable help, often genuinely, often generously, but from a position of safety. And the fundamental structures that create vulnerability in the first place remain unchanged. In the months following the storm, there were meetings, committees, reports. Government officials at all levels studied what had happened and discussed what could be done to prepare better for future emergencies. Many of the recommendations were sensible: improve snow removal equipment, establish better emergency communication systems, create more robust backup power infrastructure, develop clearer protocols for prioritizing response. But some of the most important lessons were never learned, or at least never implemented. The storm had revealed that poverty made people vulnerable, that inequality determined who suffered most, that the systems in place were designed to protect some people more than others. These were not problems that could be solved with better snowplows. They required fundamental changes to how society was structured, how resources were distributed, how value was assigned to different lives. Such changes were discussed in abstract terms, addressing systemic inequality, improving social safety nets, ensuring equitable access to resources. But concrete action was limited. It was easier to buy new equipment than to restructure society. It was politically safer to focus on technical solutions than to address questions of power and distribution. And so the preparations that were made focused largely on making the same system more efficient, rather than making it more just. The next storm, everyone agreed, would be handled better. Responses would be faster, communications would be clearer, plows would be better distributed. But the fundamental question, why some people had backup generators and others didn't, why some neighbourhoods were ploughed first and others last, why some people could afford to stock pantries and others lived paycheck to paycheck with no cushion for emergencies, this question was raised, discussed briefly, and then quietly set aside. Too complicated, too political, too much. Most people who lived through the storm didn't think much about these disparities, at least not consciously. They were focused on their own survival, their own recovery, and for many, the community response, neighbours helping neighbours, strangers sharing resources, was the dominant memory. But for some, particularly those who had experienced both the storm's physical hardship and the revelation of their own vulnerability, something shifted. They began to see more clearly how society was structured, how some lives were valued more than others, how disasters amplified inequalities that existed even in calm times. A social worker in Cleveland, interviewed 5 years after the storm, said, "It opened my eyes. I'd always known, theoretically, about poverty and inequality, but seeing how differently people experienced the same storm, that made it real. The storm didn't discriminate, it snowed on everyone equally, but the consequences were so unequal. That's when I understood that disaster doesn't create injustice, it reveals it." She wasn't alone in this recognition. Labor organizers, community activists, progressive politicians, many would point to the blizzard as a moment when the usually invisible became briefly visible, when the comfortable myths about equality and opportunity were exposed by the simple fact of who froze and who stayed warm. But recognition doesn't automatically lead to change. Most people, once the crisis passed, returned to their normal lives. The lessons faded, the urgency diminished, the systems remained largely as they were. Let us return briefly to Maria Santos, the cleaning woman we met earlier, trapped in the gas station. In interviews conducted years later for an oral history project, she reflected on the experience. "I remember thinking during the storm that everyone must be going through this. Everyone must be cold and scared and hungry. But then, when it was over, I heard stories about people who rode it out in hotels, about the governor in his warm office, about the rich people who never even lost power, and I realized we weren't all in this together. We never were." She paused, then continued. "The storm didn't change anything, really. My apartment was always cold in winter. I was always one emergency away from disaster. The blizzard just made it obvious. For a few days, I couldn't pretend that my situation was normal, that I was doing okay. The storm took away the ability to pretend." This, perhaps, is the final and most important contrast revealed by the blizzard. Not just that people experienced it differently based on their circumstances, but that for some, the storm was an aberration, a temporary departure from normal life, a dramatic story to tell. While for others it was simply an intensification of struggles that were always present. The cold was colder, but cold was familiar. The isolation was more complete, but isolation was familiar. The fear was sharper, but fear was familiar. The storm had simply turned up the volume on a song that was always playing. And so, when spring finally came and the snow melted away, two versions of the same story existed. In one version, the blizzard of 1978 was a great equalizer, a moment when everyone, regardless of status or wealth, faced the same challenge. A moment that brought communities together, that revealed the best in people, that showed how Americans pulled together in crisis. This version was told in newspaper retrospectives, in anniversary commemorations, in the comfortable middle-class memory that became the official history. In the other version, the blizzard was a revealer of division, a moment when the fault lines of society became visible, when the difference between comfort and suffering was measured not in character or effort, but in resources and luck. A moment that showed how in America, even disaster is experienced unequally. This version was told in community centers, in union halls, in the conversations of people who had learned once again that they were on their own, that help might not come, that their suffering was less important than the comfort of others. Both versions were true. The storm had brought neighbors together. It had also revealed how separate people's experiences were. It had shown the best of humanity. It had also shown how systems were designed to protect some and abandon others. The question was which truth you focused on. And that focus, more often than not, depended on which side of the divide you found yourself on. From the tower, the storm was spectacular, tragic, historic, but ultimately something that happened to other people, something observed and managed, and eventually overcome. From below, the storm was personal, present, inescapable, something that happened to you in your body, in your fear, in your cold. The view from the tower saw patterns, systems, statistics. The view from below saw hours, minutes, the endless present tense of survival. And in the space between these views, between warmth and cold, between comfort and suffering, between those who watched and those who endured, lay a truth about the world that the storm had illuminated but not changed. That we are not all equal in crisis, that our fates are determined by circumstances beyond our control, that society protects some more than others, that disaster reveals what is always true but usually hidden, that from above the snow is beautiful, from below it buries. Spring came early that year, as if nature itself felt apologetic for winter's excess. By mid-March, temperatures rose into the 50s and 60s, unseasonably warm, almost surreal, after the brutal cold that had defined January. The snow melted quickly. Too quickly, some said. The rapid thaw caused flooding in low-lying areas as weeks' worth of accumulated precipitation returned to liquid form and overwhelmed drainage systems still damaged from the freeze. Rivers swelled, basements filled. The damage continued even after the storm itself had passed. But still the warmth was welcome. People emerged from their homes like creatures coming out of hibernation, blinking, tentative, amazed to rediscover a world of color and movement after so many weeks of white stillness. Grass appeared, shockingly green against the remaining patches of grey snow. Birdsong returned. The sun, which had seemed weak and distant throughout the winter, now felt generous, almost extravagant in its warmth. You could walk outside without layers upon layers of clothing. You could feel air on your face that didn't hurt. You could see beyond your immediate surroundings, the horizon visible again, the world extending outward rather than pressing inward. The relief was almost physical. Shoulders that had been tensed against cold for months finally relaxed. Sleep became easier, deeper. The constant low-level anxiety of winter, will the pipes freeze, will the heat hold, will we have enough, gradually dissipated. People gathered outside on porches and front steps just to be in the air, to be visible to one another again. Conversations that had been impossible during the storm's isolation now flowed freely. Stories were exchanged, compared, integrated into a shared narrative. Where were you when it hit? How long were you without power? Did you hear about? The storm became story. Experience became memory. Trauma began its slow transformation into meaning. In the aftermath, there were many attempts to extract lessons from the blizzard of 1978. What had it taught us? How were we changed? Some lessons were practical. Cities and states updated their emergency response protocols. Snow removal equipment was modernized. Communication systems were improved. Building codes were revised to require better insulation, more robust heating systems, backup power capabilities. These were good changes. They made the next winter, and all subsequent winters, marginally safer. They reduced the likelihood that the same kind of paralysis could occur again. But there were other lessons, harder to codify, that lived in the bodies and minds of those who had endured. The lesson of fragility, that the systems we depend on, the infrastructure that makes modern life possible, can fail completely and suddenly, that we are always, all of us, just a few days away from cold, hunger, isolation. That civilization is thinner than we like to believe. The lesson of resilience, that humans can endure more than they think they can. That we adapt, improvise, survive. That there are reserves of strength and patience that only become visible under pressure. The lesson of community, that in crisis, people often help one another. That neighbors share resources, that strangers offer shelter, that the bonds of mutual aid can emerge even in circumstances that seem designed to isolate. But also the lesson of division, that not everyone suffers equally, that privilege provides protection, that the systems in place serve some better than others. That what brings some together also reveals the distance between others. The blizzard taught all of these lessons simultaneously, and which lesson you learned most deeply often depended on your circumstances during those white days in January. There is a particular kind of gratitude that comes after surviving something difficult, not the bright, effusive gratitude of receiving a gift, but something quieter, more profound, the gratitude of still being here, of having come through. In the months after the storm, many people reported feeling this, a heightened appreciation for small comforts, for heat that worked, for roads that were clear, for the ability to go to a store and buy food, for the sound of traffic, which had once been mere background noise but now signaled the return of normal life. They noticed their homes differently. The walls that had seemed merely functional during the storm now felt protective, almost sacred. These walls had kept the cold out. This roof had held against the weight of snow. This space had sheltered them. They noticed other people differently too. The plough driver who cleared the street became a figure of appreciation rather than someone to be taken for granted. The utility worker who restored power was greeted with genuine thanks. The grocery store clerk who showed up for work despite difficult conditions was recognized as essential in ways that hadn't been obvious before. This heightened awareness, this gratitude for the ordinary, gradually faded as memory of the storm receded. This is human nature. We adapt to comfort as quickly as we adapt to hardship. The exceptional becomes normal, the remarkable becomes routine. But for some, something of that awareness persisted. A small voice in the back of the mind that remembered. That said, quietly, when the heat clicked on or the lights stayed bright, "This is not guaranteed. This is gift, not right. This could be taken away." Not a voice of anxiety necessarily, more a voice of recognition, of not taking for granted what can be lost. The blizzard of 1978 became one of those shared reference points that defines a generation's memory of a place. If you lived in the Midwest or Northeast during that winter, you had a story about where you were, what you experienced, how you survived. These stories were told and retold at family gatherings, at work, to children and grandchildren, and with each telling, the stories evolved. Details were added or subtracted, emotions were emphasized or minimized. The narrative was shaped to serve different purposes: to entertain, to teach, to connect, to explain who the teller was and what they had overcome. Some stories emphasized adventure, the excitement of the storm, the novelty of disrupted routine, the camaraderie of shared hardship. These were good stories for parties, for casual conversations, for the light sharing of experience. Other stories emphasized suffering, the cold, the fear, the isolation, the losses. These were stories told more quietly, in moments of intimacy or therapy, when the real impact could be acknowledged rather than softened into anecdote. Still other stories emphasized contrast, the difference between then and now, between hardship and comfort, between winter and spring. These stories served as reminders of progress, of improvement, of having moved beyond that difficult time, and some stories were never told at all. Some experiences remained private, held close, too painful or too complex to translate into narrative. The person who nearly froze, the relationship that broke under the pressure, the terror that couldn't be admitted because admitting it would be admitting vulnerability. All of these stories, told and untold, became part of the collective memory of the blizzard. They formed a kind of archive, not of facts exactly, but of meaning, of what the storm meant to the people who lived through it. Now, decades later, the blizzard of 1978 has receded into history. The people who experienced it as adults are elderly now or gone. The children who lived through it are middle-aged, their memories filtered through time and the particular distortions of childhood recall. The world has changed, weather forecasting has improved dramatically, climate patterns have shifted. The storms that seemed unprecedented in 1978 have been matched or exceeded by other events. But the blizzard remains significant, at least in regional memory. It represents something, a marker of a particular kind of winter, a particular era, a particular relationship between humans and weather that feels increasingly distant. Young people today, hearing stories of the blizzard, struggle to imagine it. In an age of constant connectivity, ubiquitous smartphones, instant access to information, the idea of being truly isolated, unable to communicate, unable to know what's happening beyond your immediate surroundings, seems almost impossible. Couldn't you just call someone, they ask? Couldn't you check online? Couldn't you track the storm in real time? No, you couldn't. That's part of what made it what it was. The isolation, the uncertainty, the waiting without knowing when the waiting would end. This distance creates a kind of mythology. The storm becomes larger, more dramatic, more transformative in memory than perhaps it was in reality. It becomes a story about the old days, when things were harder, when people were tougher, when winters were colder. Whether this mythology is accurate doesn't really matter. What matters is what it represents, a connection to a past that felt more immediate, more physical, more real in some ways than the mediated, digitized present. As you lie there, listening to this story, you are warm. Perhaps you're in bed, under blankets, in a room heated to a comfortable temperature. Perhaps you're in a chair, relaxed, safe. The world outside may be cold, but you are protected from it. This is worth acknowledging. This comfort, this safety. These things are not universal or permanent. They are the result of systems and structures, of resources and luck, of living in a particular place at a particular time. The people who suffered through the blizzard of 1978 would be amazed by what we take for granted now. The ability to check weather forecasts on a device in your pocket, the insulation in modern buildings, the reliability of power grids, the sophistication of emergency response. We are more protected from winter now than humans have ever been, more insulated from the hardships that were once simply the inevitable cost of living through the cold months. This protection has costs, environmental, social, psychological, but it is also a genuine achievement, a lessening of suffering, an expansion of comfort and safety to more people than ever before. And yet winter still comes, snow still falls, cold still kills if you're exposed to it long enough. Nature has not been tamed, only temporarily managed. The systems that protect us are robust but not impervious. The comfort we experience is real, but also contingent. The blizzard of 1978 is a reminder of this, a reminder that beneath our technological sophistication and our climate-controlled environments, we are still mammals trying to stay warm enough to survive, still vulnerable to the elements we've worked so hard to separate ourselves from. After the storm, after the thaw, after the recovery and rebuilding, life returned to its rhythms. Spring gave way to summer, summer to fall, fall to winter again, though that next winter was mild, almost apologetic in its gentleness. The dailiness of existence resumed, work and school, grocery shopping and social obligations, the 1,000 small tasks that fill a life. The storm became memory, then story, then history, but something remained, a slight shift in perspective perhaps, a small recalibration of what matters and what doesn't. The people who had frozen together in gas stations or living rooms, who had shared food and warmth and fear, they remembered what it felt like when the ordinary fell away and only survival mattered. They carried that memory forward, not always consciously, not in a way that necessarily changed their daily behavior, but somewhere in the background a quiet knowledge: this can happen again, the world can stop, the comfortable rhythms can be disrupted, survival is not guaranteed. This knowledge made some people anxious, made them prepare more, worry more, hold more tightly to security and certainty. It made others more present, more appreciative of the ordinary miracle of warm houses and full refrigerators and the ability to move freely through the world. It made still others more compassionate, more aware of vulnerability, their own and others, more likely to help when they could, to share when they had extra, to recognize that luck and circumstance separate the comfortable from the suffering more often than character or effort do. All of these responses were reasonable. All were ways of integrating the experience, of making meaning from hardship, of carrying forward some lesson from those white days. In stories and myths across cultures, winter is never just a season. It is a state of being, a metaphor for hardship, death, waiting, endurance. The time when life withdraws, when growth stops, when we must rely on what we stored during easier times. The blizzard of 1978 fits into this ancient pattern. It was winter intensified, concentrated, made absolute. It was the reduction of life to its essentials: warmth, food, shelter, connection. Everything else fell away, and in that reduction, something was revealed. About what humans need, about what we can endure, about how we treat one another when the comfortable illusions of civilization are temporarily stripped away. Winter always ends. This is the promise that keeps us going during the darkest, coldest days. That spring is coming, that warmth will return, that this is temporary, however endless it feels in the moment. The blizzard ended. Spring came, life resumed, but winter will come again. Different winter, perhaps? Different form. But the same essential truth that we are vulnerable, that nature is powerful, that survival requires both individual resilience and collective care. The people who lived through the blizzard of 1978 learned this, carried it forward, told their stories, passed on whatever wisdom they could extract from the experience. And now, as you drift towards sleep, as your breathing slows and your thoughts quiet, perhaps you can carry something forward too. Not anxiety about future storms, but recognition of present comfort. Not fear of winter, but appreciation of warmth. You are safe tonight. The walls around you hold. The heat works. You have enough. This is not nothing. This is everything. The snow has melted. The stories have been told. The lessons have been learned, or haven't, or have been learned and forgotten and must be learned again. The blizzard of 1978 is history now. Data in archives. Photographs yellowing. Memories fading. The people who lived through it growing older, their numbers diminishing year by year, taking their first-hand experience with them into whatever comes next. But something persists. In the ice cores of Greenland, in the tree rings that recorded that harsh winter, in the slight shifts to building codes and emergency protocols, in the stories still told around dinner tables, in the quiet awareness, in some corner of consciousness, that winter can be fierce, that we are small against it, but that we can endure. And in this late hour, as you settle deeper into comfort, into warmth, into the gentle drift towards sleep, perhaps the blizzard can teach one final lesson. That hardship passes, that spring follows winter, that we are resilient beyond what we imagine, that the cold of January gives way to the warmth of June, always, eventually, without fail. That the white days end, that the world, however buried it becomes, always re-emerges. That morning comes and with it, light. Sleep now. Let the stories settle. Let the snow in your mind fall gently, cover everything in soft white, quiet the noise, slow the thoughts. Let winter do its work, the necessary work of rest, of restoration, of the long dark that prepares for the returning light. You are warm, you are safe. The storm has passed. And in the morning, when you wake, the world will be there, familiar and precious, ordinary and miraculous, cold perhaps, but endurable, always endurable. Until then, rest. The snow falls softly in memory, covers everything in white, and you drift gently down into the quiet place where stories become dreams, where history becomes sleep, where the cold recedes and only warmth remains. Rest now, the blizzard is over, spring is coming, sleep. Thank you for taking this quiet journey through the winter of 1978.